Today I want to talk about this through my own experience. When I lived in Europe, I felt something very clearly, something I had understood intellectually, but had never really felt before. Chinese people and Japanese people are often seen as part of the same broad group. I knew that already. But when it actually happened to me, it felt strange, uncomfortable. I grew up in Japan in the 1980s and 1990s. At that time, Japan felt like a place built on a Japanese base, with Western culture layered on top. English and French were everywhere, in music, fashion, magazines, and signs in the city. But the Chinese language itself was almost invisible in everyday life. Even Chinese restaurants often didn't feel linguistically Chinese. The first place where I clearly remember seeing and hearing a lot of Chinese was Yokohama's Chinatown. In the early 1990s, Chinese people in Japan were often talked about in the context of illegal labor. There were stories about old studio apartments where 5 or 6 people were suddenly living together. That was framed as a social problem at the time. I saw scenes like that myself, but they lived inside their own communities. They were not people most Japanese interacted with in daily life. Back then, the image of the Tiananmen Square incident was still very strong. China was often imagined as a place where people were suffering under political oppression. Then I went to university. There, I met Chinese international students who spoke fluent Japanese and were clearly very capable. They dressed well. They didn't match the image I had grown up with. After I started working, I had colleagues who were Chinese and had graduated from Japanese graduate schools. One of them used very expensive cosmetics, brands I would never buy for myself. That small detail stayed with me. By the late 2000s, I began seeing groups of people in electronics stores seriously choosing extremely expensive massage chairs and asking about shipping them to China. Looking back, my image of Chinese people didn't change all at once. It shifted quietly, over time. So the discomfort I felt in Europe was not really about Chinese people themselves. It was about a sense of distance that had been formed inside Japan. For many Japanese people, China has always been geographically close, but psychologically far. And that distance, I think, still shapes how people feel today. Up to that point, my image of Chinese people was still a fairly common one among Japanese people of my generation. Even when I met Chinese students or colleagues who were highly capable and well-dressed, they spoke fluent Japanese and were fully adapted to life in Japan. They didn't really feel foreign. Somewhere in my mind, they didn't quite match the image of China that existed on television or online, so I unconsciously treated them as exceptions. Very special Chinese people, different from the rest. The same was true when I started seeing Chinese customers making extremely expensive purchases in Japan. In the late 2000s, I assumed they must be a very small group of ultra-wealthy people. At the same time, Japanese media and online spaces were full of stories about China's rapid economic growth and its dark side. Stories about exploited labor, about enormous gaps between rural areas and major cities, about counterfeit technology and products. Taken together, China still felt like a completely different world. One that, overall, could not really compare to Japan. Those images existed in parallel, but they didn't connect. And then, I went to graduate school in the UK. That was when my image of Chinese people changed in a much more fundamental way. In the UK, I met many Chinese students I lived in the same flat as some of them, and the first person I became close to was a younger Chinese woman. One day, she said her iPhone wasn't working properly. It wouldn't sync. I hesitated, but I ended up asking her something uncomfortable. Is it a real iPhone? At that time, Japanese online media often talked about extremely realistic counterfeit products in China, phones that looked real, and people who didn't realize they were fake. But her iPhone was real. And not only that, she owned a genuine Celine bag and a genuine Chanel bag. As I spent more time with Chinese students and talked with them, the vague image I had held, that Chinese international students were all wealthy, started to gain more resolution. Some of them were indeed extremely rich. One student, I was told, was the child of a high-ranking party official and had been given a luxury car by their parents. But what surprised me was something else. Students who looked unimaginably wealthy to me would casually say things like, "We're doing okay," but compared to them, we're basically ordinary. There was a clear financial hierarchy among them. At the same time, there were also many students who lived modestly and were careful with money. Until then, I had assumed something very simple. In Japan, even families that were fairly average had sometimes made an effort to send their children to Europe or the US. In China, I thought, studying abroad must still be limited to only the very top layer of the wealthy. But around 2010, when I went to the UK for my MBA, that assumption may already have been reversing. I began to feel that people who were perhaps within the top 10% economically in China could already study abroad like this. China's population is about 1.4 billion. Japan's is about 120 million. And that was the moment when I stopped. Wait, if that's true, that was the moment I truly grasped something. Right next to Japan, there exists a population larger than Japan's entire population that may be wealthier than Japan. Of course, there are still very poor regions in China, but economically, it began to feel less like a single country and more like several different countries existing within one. This may sound obvious, but for many Japanese people, Japan is not only a country that experienced rapid economic growth after the 1960s, it is also a country that modernized in the 19th century, and for a long time, we believed Japan was #1 in Asia. Even as China developed economically, I had somehow assumed, without any real basis, that it would never truly surpass Japan. I realized that this was an illusion only after my experience in the UK, when I began to look at China more objectively. Unfortunately, many Japanese people still seem to feel as if Japan could somehow return to its peak in the 1990s.